Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most complex and dangerous situations unfolding quietly behind the front lines of Russia's war against Ukraine, how Alexander Lukashenko, the longtime ruler of Belarus, is becoming increasingly cornered as Russia's war begins to slowly destroy Belarus from within, while global attention remains fixed on the battlefield in Ukraine. An equally consequential story is developing to the north, a story of dependence, manipulation, and political survival that may define the future of Eastern Europe. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Belarus played a critical role. Lukashenko allowed Russian troops to use Belarusian territory as a staging ground for attacks on Kiev. Russian missiles were launched from Belarus, and Russian aircraft operated from Belarusian bases. In return, Moscow promised Lukashenko protection, money, and political backing, but what seemed like a guarantee of power may now be turning into a trap. The closer Belarus moves to Russia, the more it loses its own independence, economy, and international standing. Lukashenko, often called Europe's last dictator, has ruled Belarus since 1994. For nearly 3 decades, he balanced between Russia and the West, playing both sides to his advantage. He relied on cheap Russian gas and oil, while trying to maintain limited connections with Europe to keep his options open. But that balancing act collapsed after the 2020 Belarusian presidential election, when Lukashenko claimed victory amid widespread accusations of massive fraud. The country erupted in the largest protests in its history. Facing the threat of losing power, Lukashenko turned completely to Moscow for support. Vladimir Putin stepped in as Lukashenko's savior, sending money, political recognition, and security assistance. In exchange, Russia began tightening its control over Belarus. Since then, the line between the two countries has grown increasingly blurry. Belarus has become economically dependent on Russia, politically isolated from the West, and militarily intertwined with Moscow's war machine. The supposed ally relationship now looks more like quiet annexation. Inside Belarus, Lukashenko is walking on a tightrope. On one hand, he must prove loyalty to Putin, whose regime guarantees his survival. On the other hand, he faces resentment from his own population, who largely oppose the war in Ukraine. Polls, though limited and often suppressed, suggest that most Belarusians do not want their soldiers fighting in Ukraine. Many see the war as Putin's imperial project, not theirs. This has left Lukashenko in an impossible position, a dictator supported by Moscow, ruling over a population that fears being dragged into a foreign war. Economically, Belarus is paying a steep price. Western sanctions imposed after Lukashenko's 2020 crackdown and intensified after Russia's invasion have cut the country off from European trade and finance. The Belarusian ruble has weakened, inflation has risen, and foreign investment has vanished. Key industries like potash exports and manufacturing have been crippled by trade restrictions. Once a modestly stable economy supported by Russian subsidies and Western markets, Belarus now finds itself isolated, dependent only on Moscow's good, a dangerous position for any small nation. At the same time, the Belarusian military has become deeply entangled with Russia's war effort. Thousands of Russian troops have been stationed in Belarus since 2022. Russian nuclear weapons have reportedly been deployed on Belarusian soil, marking a historic shift in European security. While Lukashenko insists he has not sent Belarusian troops into Ukraine, he has allowed his country to serve as a logistical and training hub for Russian operations. This makes Belarus a co-belligerent in the eyes of Kiev and the West, and a potential future target should the war escalate. Lukashenko's strategy seems simple: survive at any cost, but that survival is coming at the expense of Belarus's sovereignty. Every Russian base built in Belarus, every economic dependency reinforced, and every joint military exercise further reduces his freedom to act independently. Putin understands this perfectly. For Moscow, controlling Belarus is not just about supporting an ally, it's about extending strategic depth, creating a northern front against NATO, and ensuring that no Western, friendly government ever emerges in Minsk. Yet despite Lukashenko's outward loyalty, there are growing signs of tension between Minsk and Moscow. Lukashenko has publicly complained about Russia's attempts to dominate Belarusian industries, about unfair trade deals, and about Moscow's pressure to integrate more deeply under the so-called Union State framework. He occasionally reminds Putin that Belarus is a sovereign country, not a Russian province. These statements are mostly symbolic, but they reveal the quiet fear that Lukashenko could one day lose control entirely. Meanwhile, opposition forces in exile, led by Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, continue to operate from abroad. They argue that Russia's war is destroying Belarus's independence and that Lukashenko has turned the country into an occupied satellite. The Belarusian diaspora, spread across Poland, Lithuania, and other parts of Europe, is growing increasingly vocal, calling for new elections and international isolation of the regime. Western governments, however, face a dilemma. Any direct confrontation with Lukashenko could push him even further into Putin's arms, yet ignoring Belarus risks allowing Moscow to fully absorb it. The Russian invasion has also reshaped Belarusian society in subtle but powerful ways. Thousands of Belarusians have fled the country since 2020, not just political dissidents but ordinary citizens who see no future under Lukashenko's rule. Many have gone to Ukraine or the European Union. Some Belarusians even joined Ukraine's armed forces, forming volunteer battalions to fight against Russia. These individuals see the war not only as a fight for Ukraine's freedom, but for the eventual liberation of Belarus itself. Their message is simple: as long as Putin and Lukashenko remain in power, both nations will remain prisoners of dictatorship. Inside the country, repression continues relentlessly. Security services monitor social media, arrest critics, and silence dissent. The independent press has been crushed, and hundreds of journalists have been jailed or forced into exile. Even expressing sympathy for Ukraine can result in imprisonment. In this environment, fear dominates daily life, and loyalty to the regime is often the only way to survive. But beneath the surface, discontent brews quiet conversations, secret networks, and underground movements that refuse to accept that Belarus's fate is to be swallowed by Russia's empire. The irony is that Lukashenko once prided himself on being a master of survival, the man who could play Russia and the West against each other. Now, he has no cards left. Putin's war has cornered him completely. Without Russia's support, his regime would collapse within weeks. With it, he remains in power, but only as a puppet. Every move he makes now strengthens Moscow's control while weakening Belarus's independence. The walls are closing in, and Lukashenko knows it. There are also security risks building quietly within Belarus. The presence of Russian troops and nuclear weapons creates potential instability. If political unrest were to erupt again, or if Putin demanded even deeper integration, Belarus could become the next flashpoint in Europe. NATO closely monitors developments, especially along the borders with Poland and Lithuania, where tensions are rising. The Suwałki Gap, a narrow land corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad, has become one of the most strategically sensitive regions in the world. Any miscalculation there could draw Europe into a wider conflict. As Russia's war drags on, the costs for Belarus keep rising. Trade with Ukraine has collapsed, tourism has disappeared, and sanctions are tightening. Even China, once seen as a potential alternative partner, has become cautious about deepening economic ties with Minsk. Lukashenko's visits to Beijing bring smiles and promises, but little real investment. Everyone knows that Belarus's fate is now tied to Russia's, and few are willing to risk Western penalties for supporting the regime. The long-term consequences for Belarus could be devastating. The economy may never fully recover. The brain drain of young professionals, scientists, and engineers is accelerating. Entire industries that once exported to Europe are being redirected toward Russia's struggling market. The nation's international isolation is so complete that even friendly countries treat it as an extension of Moscow. For ordinary Belarusians, the dream of sovereignty and reform now feels like a distant memory. Lukashenko's personal predicament is equally bleak. He can neither step away from Putin nor fully embrace him without losing legitimacy. His attempts to portray himself as an independent leader sound hollow when Russian troops patrol his soil. His boasts about maintaining peace ring false when his country serves as a launchpad for war. The very image that kept him in power, the strongman who protects Belarus from chaos, is collapsing under the weight of Moscow's ambitions. Russia's war is not only destroying Ukraine, it's destroying Belarus's future too. For Putin, Belarus is a pawn, a buffer zone, and a testing ground for imperial restoration. For Lukashenko, it's a trap of his own making, one that may end his rule or his country's independence. The tragedy of Belarus lies in the fact that its people never chose this path. They did not vote for war, repression, or isolation. They wanted dignity, freedom, and a chance to decide their own destiny. Yet history has not given up on Belarus. Every war eventually ends, and every dictatorship eventually falls. When that time comes, Belarus may again have a chance to rebuild, to rejoin Europe, and to reclaim its sovereignty. The courage of those who continue to resist journalists, exiles, volunteers, and ordinary citizens keeps that hope alive. They understand that the struggle for Belarus is not separate from the struggle in Ukraine. It's part of the same battle between tyranny and freedom. As the war grinds on, Lukashenko's position grows weaker. Russia's failures on the battlefield, its economic decline, and its increasing isolation make it a less reliable partner. The more desperate Putin becomes, the more pressure he will place on his allies. Lukashenko knows that when Putin's empire starts to crumble, he may be the first to be sacrificed. There will be no mercy for those who served as tools and then outlived their usefulness. In the end, Lukashenko's legacy may be that of a man who traded his nation's independence for the illusion of power. He believed he could control the forces he unleashed, but instead, they consumed him. The war that began as Russia's invasion of Ukraine is slowly spreading into Belarus's political, economic, and social fabric, tearing it apart from within. The destruction may not come through bombs and tanks, but through dependency, corruption, and fear. For the world, the lesson is clear. Autocrats who align themselves with empires rarely survive the partnership. The same power that props them up eventually devours them. Belarus today stands as a warning of what happens when sovereignty is sacrificed for security, and when leaders cling to power by surrendering to a stronger neighbor. The consequences are written not only in politics, but in the lives of millions who now live under the shadow of war. And as the story continues to unfold, one thing becomes certain: Lukashenko is running out of room to maneuver. The man once called Europe's last dictator may soon become something even smaller. a footnote in Russia's collapsing imperial project, a ruler who lost everything by trying to save himself. The destruction of Belarus may not be immediate, but it has already begun, and the world is only starting to notice.